Okay, cool. Looks like we are live. Hi everyone. So today, or at least right now, this evening, we're doing the, I guess, conclusion of this two-part live stream that I'm doing. So, previously, I had a stream of just, hey, I was accepted to give a talk at a conference, and I have not created the talk. I had it in mind already. I've done other talks in that realm of Pulumi stuff. But this one specifically, I have not created the resources, the slide deck and all of that fun stuff. So last time we got a head start on that. We started the slides. We're using MARP, which you can see on my screen right now. It's all just Markdown driven. We have our attributes and we've got our titles and all that fun stuff. And that was pretty much it from last time. So since then, I've worked on it more. I've fleshed out a lot more of the slides, and have completed the demo code. That was a big thing. I always like to have some demo code to show certain things off as we're talking, showing things on screen. So again, the big purpose of last week and this week is really just to say, hey, this is one way to go about making a presentation. So if you've never done that before and you want to get into it, this is my way. Other people have their own preferences, all of that stuff. If you like this, cool. If there's anything you don't like about it, if you have anything that can improve it, let me know. I personally, I always want to learn and grow. So if you have any ideas, you think I'm doing something really stupid, definitely let me know. Be nice about it though, because if you're mean in comments, then I'm not gonna. I'm really just not gonna listen to you. That's how that goes, right? All right, cool. So the plan for today is to just do a dry run of this talk. So my normal process is once I think I have the slides pretty good, I'm gonna go ahead and run through all of these, and you can kind of see as I'm scrolling that there's a decent amount of slides. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to do during this process. Number one is just make sure that I know what I'm going to say, right? Like it's a slide deck, right? So everything is bullet pointed. So there's that. I want to make sure that there isn't too much on certain slides. Maybe I can split that up into different slides. So that's something that I will be doing, right? So I'll be talking, and then maybe I'll just stop partway through. Another thing is also making sure that the order seems right. Maybe I'll get to some point and think, nah, this should be earlier. So let's edit that. Let's change it. And then finally, the last thing is I'm gonna go ahead and time this as we're going. So on a different monitor, I'll move that back. On a different monitor, no, excuse me, I will have the stopwatch running. Just as a general guide, it's not so handy in this first run through because I'm going to be stopping, so I'll stop myself talking and then I'll click go on the stopwatch, and then like half the time I do that, I forget to restart the stopwatch. So it at least gives me a general idea. For this presentation specifically, it's 1 hour, but I like to aim for 50 minutes to give time for questions. So that's going to be the goal, me talking for 50 minutes and all of that. So on my machine right here, I already have everything loaded up. I have the slides generated. So let's actually go to that instead of this markdown screen that you're seeing on screen. I have a couple of tabs open already. I have all of my Pulumi resources generated, so I've already run Pulumi up. So just before starting this, I ran Pulumi destroy and ran up again just to start fresh and all of that stuff. I have zoom it. Whoops, wrong button. I have zoom it enabled. Oh no. There we go. Let's see. Is it? Oh no. How do I leave? This might not be good. Let's see. 1 second. I'm gonna have to lock my screen, I think, to get out of this. Because that screen's not updating, and I thought, oh, nope, there we go, it's one. Sorry, let me explain what just happened. So there's this utility called Zoom It, and let me search for it. Zoom It. It's really handy. I've been using it for years, but I don't talk nearly as often as I used to, so I forget the tools. But it's a free tool from Microsoft. Just download it and run it. but it's control 1 through 4. So control 1, I thought, yeah, there we go. That zooms in, so you can see it, and then I click, and I can draw. Control 2 was this thing, where I'm just drawing. And I guess I have to hit control 1 to leave that, so that's what confused me. Control 3, it follows the mouse, but it zooms in. And then I forget what 4 did. It's a timer. Okay, we're not using that one. So for the most part, usually I'll use 1. I'll zoom in, click, and like underline something as I talk. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and start talking. Let's see. So a couple of things. I do like to do these practice runs as if I were actually there. So there will be a couple of times where I'm gonna feel a little stupid, where I say, "Has anyone blah blah blah," or "Does anyone know about blah?" Right, and I'll give a couple of seconds waiting for, maybe a response or show of hands, that kind of thing. So I am going to do that here in this talk. I guess the only thing that I'm doing differently is normally when I do the practice run, I'm standing, but I don't think the webcam is set up well enough for that. So I'm just going to go ahead and stay sitting the entire time. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and start my stopwatch now. Hey everyone, welcome to this talk. Cool, you're here for the practical Pulumi session with me, Al Rodriguez. I have to capitalize my name there because if I don't, everyone thinks it's AI. So a couple of things about me, and then a little bit about this presentation. First of all, if you search Programmer Al on social media stuff, you should be able to find me, or my website, programmeral.com. I do want to be clear that I am not affiliated with Pulumi. I'm not paid by them, or I'm not employed by them at all. I'm just a guy who really likes this tool set and not the other big one. So I want more people to know about this one. So that's why I keep talking about it. So in the future, when I'm looking for a job and want to do stuff with Pulumi, I have a much better chance than I do today. Now, everything that I'm going to be saying, all of the slides that we're looking at right here, all of the demo code that I'm going to show you, that is all already online. So there's two ways to do that. You can go ahead and scan this QR code that I have right here. And then that'll take you directly to my personal site, programmeral.com, on the page that has links to this talk. Now, here at Boston Code Camp, I'm doing 2 talks. I did one earlier. So that page, it's the same page for both, so just find the header with the correct link. If you're one of those people who does not like using QR codes, and subsequently, I guess, you don't use Google to search for anything, you can just type in the URL directly, programmeral.com, and as of right now, it's going to be the first article that shows up. It's the one titled Boston Code Camp. All right, cool. And then if you don't get this info, I show it again at the end, so I'm just going to move on. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of level setting right now. I want to make sure we all understand what we're here for. What is this session? This is more of an intermediate session with Pulumi. So I assume that you either know the basics of Pulumi, maybe you've done a couple of tutorials, maybe you've even used Pulumi before for like a personal project or something. But, this is... if you've used it a lot, then you're not going to get a lot out of here. So I'm a little sorry about that. If maybe the title was a little misleading. But you know what? Maybe you will learn something. We'll see. So stick around. Now everything, all of the demos stuff, everything that I'm going to be using is in C# and Azure. But I want to be clear that every single thing that I talk about here is not specific to C# and or Azure. So everything I talk about can be used in all of the programming languages and clouds that Pulumi supports. All right, and with that, let's get into, I guess, the talk itself. So this is a very bad drawing, which means that I drew it, or created it. And then this is diagramming the 2 Pulumi apps that I created for demos. So we're going to go back and forth with some of the demo code in these slides. But I wanted you to know ahead of time that there are 2 separate code solutions for this. There's a shared one and the app one, essentially. So within the shared one, we have a single instance of Azure App Config. Out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people have used Azure App Config? Okay, just a few. So to everyone here who has not used it, the idea behind Azure App Config is it is a specific service where you can share config. That's what it is. It's for storing config values. The idea is, in our use case, but also a pretty common use case, is that you store config values, key value pairs, and then you have a label or a tag that says that what environment that value is for. So I can say, my key and have my value, and then that one's for the dev environment, and then my key, my value, and that one's for the QA environment, right? So I had to do this exact thing in the past before because AppConfig in Azure has a free instance of that service, and you can only have one. So for my personal project, I just share that free one because it's a personal project. It doesn't get that much use. It's not worth paying for that. So that's the first one. It's just the app config. Now the other one, the actual app infrastructure, as you can see, has two resources. We have the Azure function and a storage account. The storage account is just to store the Azure function so it can run. The Azure function uses a little bit of config that we set, but it also uses the config from Azure App Config. So the only config that we actually set when creating the Azure function is the connection string info to talk to Azure App Config. So I'll be bringing up the different code for these two solutions as we go. I just wanted you to have a general idea of how those two things work. All right, so let's start with a quick reminder. So again, this is an intermediate session on Pulumi. I assume you have the basic idea here, but I like level setting. And if you haven't seen this in a while, it's probably a good refresher. So I've taken this image from Pulumi's website. I do not remember where it is. I'm sorry about that. But the idea here is that this is talking about, what's the flow of you have your code, the language host right there. Like, let's say you wrote your code in JavaScript. So you have your index.js. So you type Pulumi up in your CLI, your terminal of choice. And it says, okay, well, we know that we need to make a resource of some type. So then that goes to the Pulumi engine. So first of all, just a quick reminder that we all type our Pulumi code. And what we create doesn't run as an application, right? It's essentially it's basically a DLL of some sort, right? Pulumi runs our code for us in its, sandbox. I don't know if that's the right word, but I don't want to say container because I don't want anyone to get confused with, containers like Docker or something. But Pulumi is the thing running it. So once it knows, hey, this is everything that we need to create. Here are the 5 resources and whatever. Here are the dependencies. Pulumi then takes that file and compares it to the previous run of it. So if it's the first time it's run, then hey, we need to create everything. But if not, we're checking with the last deployed state, and Pulumi is going to go ahead and just do a diff on those two things, right? So what has changed? Is there something new? Has something been deleted? Do we need to update a config value? Any of that stuff. And then, once it's figured out what it has to do, then it calls the individual providers, and those are the things that run our specific code. So in our examples today, we're only going to be using Azure. But, if you wanted to have a multi-cloud solution, which is something I do very regularly in a side project of mine. I use Azure for the majority of things, but I also have some Cloudflare stuff. In the past, I've also had some other things in there, DigitalOcean and some like DN Simple for DNS management, which worked out well at the time, but I've since tried to make things a little simpler. But yeah, that's the power of all those providers. So each one is essentially being hosted on their own. Okay. Edit note for myself. I need to really bring this down. So I will work on that later, and that's good to know. But so rewinding a little bit, since this is the dry run. Oh, I forgot to start that stopwatch. Oh well, good enough. All right. So once we have the deployed, once we compare to that deployed state, once we have that diff, then individual things are run in as parallel of a way as can be, right? All right, so let's move on. So the first grouping of things that we're going to talk about is with Pulumi is dependencies, right? So let's just make sure that we all understand how this works. All right, so again, I'm assuming that everyone here has used Pulumi to some extent before. How many people here feel like they understand how inputs and outputs work? Okay, got it. It took me too long, I guess, to figure this out because I didn't read about it. I just started working with Pulumi, and then one day I learned about outputs and realized that they're not actually the value that I thought they were, and that just became like, great. Now I have to read all this stuff. Oh no, one of those times, right? So the idea is inputs outputs are dependencies. You don't always have a value for them. You write your code in a way that it can get the value at a later time when it does actually have that value. So here's the example that I have mentioned up there. Something that we're going to be using actually in our stuff is let's say you create something like an Azure function. There are a lot of resources in Azure, and I assume many of the other clouds where it has some kind of endpoint or it has certain config values that are set by the cloud provider. Like, we don't have it. So for example, the Azure function, right? When we create a new Azure function, it always has a specific URL that Azure gives it. Now we can give it a custom domain, but it still has that original one. So for the examples that we're going to go over today, we are not giving it a custom domain just for simplicity, but we will have that value later. So here's a code example you can kind of see right there. And that's an edit point for me. I think I'm going to have to try to maybe make that text smaller or something. But I want to show that, you know what? Let's make a change. All right, so I'm stopping my stopwatch. Let me go over here. I wonder if, let's see, if I change this to X, is that good enough? Will that... Let's see if that works. Okay. Bring that over here. It's not that good. Let's see. Let me make the sizes of these. Endpoint. URL. That might not work. Looking it over at the other screen. Let's try that. Let's try that. Because I want the code example to be very clear. And I look over here. So close, but so far away. Okay. Let's see. Let's try one more where we say instead of the name my resource, it's called item. Sure, right? Or func, because I'm talking about Azure functions up here. So yeah, sure. Let's take that. Let's replace it. Okay, let me get rid of these other tabs. Hey, perfect. It's one line. Okay, cool. All right. And you know what? I just have the word get, so we need to update what I mean by that. Oh, that's part of this. You know what? That's easy enough. We'll just get rid of that. Perfect. So let's export that slide. Let's move that over here. Perfect. I like it. Okay, cool. Starting that stopwatch now. All right. So the idea behind outputs is that we don't know what the value is, but we do need to interact with it. So here's a code sample right here. So let's say that func, that variable func right there, is an Azure function. Azure functions have an endpoint, but it doesn't have necessarily the HTTPS at the beginning, right? So if we want to store that in config somewhere, or maybe we want to give that value to something else, we need to do string manipulation, right? That's a whole common thing. So we create a new output object, and so this output object, the string variable right there, it will be HTTPS : or / with the actual URL of endpoint once it's created. So this lambda doesn't run until after endpoint has a value, not necessarily directly after, but at some point, right? And so that's one of the things that Pulumi does for us. to figure certain things out. That's part of that dependency management, right? You know, resource A is dependent on B, is dependent on C, and then D over here is dependent on B. So, or yeah, D is dependent on C. So then, you know, you can't make D or B until C exists, right? That's essentially the problem, right? It's that graph problem that it's working for. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say about inputs and outputs. Let's go ahead and you know, let's see an example. Let's go look at some code of that over here. So this is the Pulumi code, specifically for the infra app. So remember when I was talking about the two different Pulumi solutions, we have the shared one and the actual app one. So this is the one for the app. So in this scenario, let me go down to my Azure builder. So this is the code over here that's going to generate multiple things. And so this instance right here, we're creating an instance of the Azure storage account, right? This is where the Azure function, when compiled, is going to go into storage. And so that storage account, if we go down here to this blob, all right, pausing the timer, stopwatch. All right, this is something for me. Sometimes I go back and forth on the code, and I don't have a good spot already in mind. So I need to find a good spot to talk about this. That's not from something that's created. I might do that. Oh, perfect. HTTPS endpoint. Okay. Oh, actually, here we go. Perfect. Okay, and play. All right, so this is the method. So remember when I mentioned that in the shared instance of stuff that we have Azure config. And so that is just to store the config of things that we're going to be using, right? Really, it's just to demo some functionality of Pulumi. So this section of code that we're looking at right here, this is what actually creates those config values and puts them into that other config. So we have our shared instance, and then this code that we're looking at. So something that I'll show a little bit later is actually loading that shared stuff. But right now, we're just going to go ahead and create the values that get put in there. And so you can see right here with the resource group name or config store name, this is where we're doing some work to, where we're using the apply method, right? So we know now that this key value, this item, has a dependency on, well, two things right here, because we need to apply these things. So once the resource group name and config store name actually do have values, once that's guaranteed, then this can be created. But until then, it's just kind of in limbo, essentially, right? So that's what's going on. You can also see that exact same concept up here, just in that that code that we were looking at, same exact thing. So this is something that I've done many times before. All right, cool. So let's go back to the slides. So the next big section of stuff we're going to talk about is config. So first of all, let's start with a reminder of how config works. I'm going to pause that stopwatch. I don't really like this output, or this stuff. So, because really what this is this is like config suggestions. So let's do that, config suggestions. And let's put a question mark there. Okay, cool. Let's do that. We'll export this, and we'll make our way back to the slides. Okay, let's get back to that section. Okay, and play on the stopwatch. Okay, cool. So now we're talking about config. Let's look at some things that are really suggestions, some things that I think come in handy a lot. And honestly, like this slide right here is the thing that made me first think about this talk, right? I have my personal learnings of things that I figured out that help me, or at least help with the Pulumi code that I've been writing. And so these are some things that I definitely want to mention to you. So first of all, it's very common to go ahead and load your Azure config, your Pulumi config with individual values. So here, let's look at an example, right? We can load resource group name or function path. And if we actually look at where this is loaded, these two things go into the same object. But that's kind of a hassle in a sense, right? Like, as programmers, a thing that we do very often is making sure that we understand that things do work together. So the example that I like to give is, load things as objects when possible. So here we have an example of Azure config, or sorry, I keep saying Azure when I mean Pulumi. I'm so sorry. It's because all this stuff is using Azure resources. So here we have an example of a config that loads the actual object itself. And we're doing the same thing with this other one here, external stacks. Now that one's only one value, so that's a personal preference, I guess. But I still think that it's easier to do that because then, like, let's say we have this example right here where we have our three variables that we load individually and then throw into an object. I mean, that's fine. It's just it feels like more code that has to be added, and we want to keep things simple. The other suggestion is try to avoid exceptions where possible. So there are two things that I mentioned there. Load everything at once, like right at the start. Your Pulumi app starts, load all your config. The second thing is load values as required. So I know that throws an exception, but what I really mean is avoid exceptions in the middle of the run. You know what? I'm going to edit that. So pausing the stopwatch. Let's go back here. Avoid. Let's see. At the start. Let's see. Avoid. Or mid-run. There we go. Avoid exceptions mid-run. Cool. I think that's much better of a term. Okay, back, turning the stopwatch on now. All right, and so you want to avoid your exceptions, avoid letting exceptions happen in the middle of the run. So that means load everything right at the start when you load up, so that way it doesn't create any resources partway through. And then you also want to try to load values as required. I assume most of the time, most config is going to be required. So, you don't have to load everything as required. I assume if you know for a fact that something can be, null or not set, then that's okay, right? Just code around it. So the reason for this is you don't want to, type Pulumi up in your CLI and then you find out that, yeah, it ran, but it threw an exception. So it created only half of the things. And unfortunately, because even though Pulumi tries to do as much as it can to, make this a desired state config type of thing, it's still reliant on those providers to do things in a way that you would expect. So there's been a scenario in the past where I was doing something where I would forget to, put a value in, like add a new property, right? I go in and I added the code for this config for like some new property, and I use it, but I don't actually enter the value into the config. And when I ran that, the application crashed, which is correct, right? What it should do in that scenario, the way that I had coded it. But the downside was that the Azure stuff ended up in a bad state, and then I had to go and manually run, Pulumi refresh, and then it got the state. And then I have to run it again, which is a little bit of a hassle. But you don't want to be in a half state, especially if you're using this to go to prod, and then now you have potentially mess up your prod environment. That's essentially where I was trying to get to. So let's look at some code examples of what that looks like. So now I like to, in my main program, I like to just have what I call global config. Just some object that has references to all of the config. And let's go to the definition of that. So here's my global config. It's a record, and it just has all of the config values loaded. So I mentioned that, sorry, let me go back to the config. Remember I mentioned that these three values, the Azure Resource Group name and all that stuff, those are loaded individually versus these other two are loaded as an object, right? So you can see the different work that kind of has to happen. So if I'm loading things one at a time, I can just require that value be there, right? Those strings, and then we're good, we're set. Um, but if we're not, then we can, or if we're loading as an object, then we can require an object exists. Now, require an object, you can tell, is just a one-liner, and that's so a little easier, right? It's nicer. The problem is that it doesn't enforce that a value is there. It enforces that, you know, we have something named, you know, service config, but if environment is missing, then I'm not going to get any kind of exception. So that is where some specific code exists. So a pattern that I like to do is to make my config and config DTO objects. So let me go to this one as an example. So I created the external stacks config as a record, and something I did forget to mention is that with my C# stuff, I like to turn on nullable warnings. So if something could be null, right, I'll get a warning. Actually, edit. Nope. Really quick. Okay. Okay. Cool. All right. That is something that I like to put in. So I'm going to add that to the others because I'm guessing I missed that. So let's enable those. Cool, we're good there. And on the example app also, and this is the one where I'm worried might get an error. Oh yeah, we're good. Okay, awesome. Okay, turning the stopwatch back on now. So just something so you know, on my solutions when I write the code for them, I like to enable all of the nullable stuff within C#, so that way I get warnings when nullable values, when I have something in there that might be null that the code doesn't handle. And then I also like to treat warnings as errors, so that if I mess up and miss a nullable value, I get a compiler warning, right? I want to be told about that stuff ahead of time. So back to this config example that I was talking about. So I have this base class, and this is just something, it's really simple. It's just an abstract method to do the conversion. So, oops, oh no, I closed the wrong tab. So when loading config, we can load these values, shared stack name, for example, the one value, and then we do a check on all of those. So this one, a little bit boring because it only has the one. Let's see. Service config. Yeah, here we go. Same concept. You can see, we just have two properties here. So these can be null. And then before we create the service config, we check each individual one and then return an instance of that. So you can see the code in the this global config over here is really simple. We require the object and then we call that method, right? Generate valid config objects. So and that's it. Then we have our instance. So if I mouse over it, we have an instance of our external stacks config. I don't know why it has a question mark. We know for a fact that it's not null, but that's a little confusing to me. I guess it's just always, I guess that question mark is always there. All right, well, that's good to know. Yeah, so, and then you can see me doing the same thing down here, generate this. I only did it a little earlier because that config value is used immediately for loading some stuff, which we will talk about in a bit. All right. Any questions on this part, actually, as far as config goes, loading stuff? I'm going to assume no questions and move on with the slides. All right. Cool. So let's move on to the next thing. Config inputs. Okay. So, yeah, you probably already read the part where I say it doesn't exist, but let me explain what I mean by config inputs. So, when we run our Pulumi stuff, right, we go to our command line and we type Pulumi up. So naturally, we would think, hey, if we're running this from the command line, I should be able to give values for maybe some config, right? I mean, I can already say, which stack to run and all of that stuff. So no, that's not an option, right? So the example would be if I go back here and I go to, this one, I say like, hey, you know what I want? I want my CI/CD pipeline every time it runs to say like this version, this is going to be the version number of whatever the CI/CD pipeline is, right? So, for example, with GitHub Actions, if I want to run this, my build has some globally unique number, right? Some like 10 character thing. I want this version to be that. That is not an option, unfortunately. And that's just how Pulumi works, right? So I assume it has something to do with the fact that it keeps track of the config. So as an example, if I go to one of my stacks over here, and I go to this one, let's say Pulumi app, the one we keep looking at, and I go to config, right? This is the config that's used, and so Pulumi is keeping track of that. So my assumption is that you cannot do the inputs because of that. I could also be 100% wrong in that. No idea. But so if you want to do that, you have two options, which I kind of mentioned up there. First of all is the one that I've done actually quite a bit is to just edit that YAML before running it. So let's say, for example, you have a CI/CD pipeline. Well, you have a CI/CD pipeline. So just have something that loads the YAML into memory, edits the actual text, and then writes back out to the file. It's a hack, but it works very well. I use it all the time. It's effective. So then you can have in your, on your local machine, dev version, right? Or if you were ever to, create a new stack, let's say, you have your pulumi.prod or something, you can still say, local version. Usually I put local, not dev. But that's the idea, right? You want something there so that way, in case something messes up later on, you at least kind of know about it a little, right? So there's that. The other example is you want to load load your config from some external source. So an example of this would be, let's say you have like some file somewhere and you just want to load config values from that file, right? That could be it. We're talking about using Azure App Config for this solution. Maybe you want to do that. You can load the values from Azure App Config, and a person can go in and manually edit that whenever they want. Personally, I do not like that idea because I want some kind of traceability to values, but it's config. It's all right, fine. Yeah, you can do that, right? We're using Pulumi. We're able to use a general purpose coding language, so we can do whatever we want. I used to work with a guy who would say that, hey, we have a general purpose programming language. We can do whatever we want. So yeah, we can do that with Pulumi. The one downside to doing that, though, is that those config values are not tracked. So like I mentioned over here, if I load values, it's not Pulumi config. It's config, right, in terms of what we think config is, but it's not what Pulumi keeps track of in terms of their config. Alrighty. Next up, still talking about Pulumi, is secrets. So just to talk about secrets, I assume that you've used secret. All right, I'm going to pause the stopwatch. This is a tough one because I don't have any secrets stored here. Do I need to mention something? Okay, let's see. All right, so I'm going to do this. Pulumi config set help, because I always forget the full thing for this. Basically, I want to get a value here. So let's say Pulumi config set. So the key is going to be my secret, my value, secret. I'll do this into dev. Perfect. So I'm going to go back to here. We'll do that. Actually, we'll just get rid of that. I think this is better. All right. I think that's good. Okay, cool. So now if I go here, oh, that was the wrong one. That was this one. Yeah, there we go. So we got that secret. Okay. You know what? I'm gonna leave that. I'm gonna leave that my secret right there. I like that. Okay. Even though it's not used, it's there. Okay. Let's go back here. Let's export these slides. Yes, I do want to replace it. Perfect. Cool. Okay. Starting the stopwatch again now. All right, so let's talk a little bit about secrets as far as they exist in config. So, just quick reminder, refresher of how secrets work with Pulumi. So we have some, an example CLI command right there. So we're going to add a secret to our config. It's titled my secret. The actual value is my value, right? We're entering that in plain text from the CLI, but we give it the secret flag. And so that gets encrypted into the YAML. And so if we go to this other one, we see this right here. This is the secure value. So there's some pros and cons to this approach. It is checked into source control. I like that concept. It's encrypted in the sense that you as a person have to be signed in with Pulumi and have the permissions to see it, but then you are able to see it within the CLI. There's a command to be able to view all of those values. So that's good. Personally, I feel like it's really clunky. I never really liked that idea, so I've always put my secrets somewhere else. And so you have two options. You can use like a provider of some sort. So I know that with 1Password, you can actually go ahead and load your secrets as config from 1Password. I saw a demo of it. I have not used that. I do not know why I put Azure Key Vault there. You know what? I'm going to pause that. I'm going to edit that because I did not see them do that with Azure Key Vault, so that should not be an example. So I will say that. Perfect. All right. Secrets. Okay, cool. And play. All right, something like 1Password. The other example is that, again, just like with config, write your own custom code to load values from somewhere. So something that I've done is on startup, I want some values from Azure Key Vault. As an organization, we've standardized around using Azure Key Vault for our secrets. So everything is in there. So the Pulumi stuff just gets access to read from there, and it gets the values from there. Just like with config, where we're loading, just like I mentioned with config, if we're loading something as a config value, but not the way Pulumi treats config values, these values are not tracked by Pulumi. So that is a pro or con depending on your mindset. All right. Next up, let's talk about the one of the newest features of Pulumi, Pulumi ESC. I don't actually know how to pronounce that now that I think about it. Let's call it. Let's just say ESC. So ESC stands for Environment Secrets and Configuration. This was announced a month ago by Pulumi, just this past October. This is a separate tool for managing your config values everywhere. So you know how over here when I was talking about with secrets or even config that I would load values from different things, different environments. Well, let's say that you're in a different environment where you have values all over the place. Let's say you have some in Azure Key Vault, and let's say that you have some in 1Password, and let's say that you have some other secrets or config values just stored in 7 other places. Pulumi ESC is here to essentially help you with that, and so that's the idea of it. I am not going to say any more on the topic, only because it's new and I don't have enough experience working with it, so I don't want to come out here and say something very wrong. But I am bringing it up just to let you know that from what I've read, I think that this actually is really good at solving that problem. So letting you know that it exists, feel free to do your own research on it, but I don't want to say too much about it outside of that. So next we're going to go into our final section of this talk, which I did not have a good title for, so I just said other stuff. Before we do that, any questions on anything we've talked about so far? Okay, moving on. All right. Hold on. I'm pausing the stopwatch. Really quick. All right, page 14 of 21. What else have I got? Ooh, that's a lot of stuff, it feels like. All right, cool. All right, so and these are every slide is going to be something different, just so you know. So the first is get functions. Get functions are static functions that will load cloud resources that already exist. So these are also read only, so you can get the information about a resource, and then first of all, you're not able to edit it at all with Pulumi with these things. So these are things that they don't necessarily have to be managed by Pulumi. These can be things that you load the information for just to get the You know what? So I'm thinking ahead a little bit, and I think I need to change the order of these two because I have demo code for these, and this is the order that I want to show it. So we're going to do that. Alright, looking at time, it's 32 minutes. First run's never that good just because of because we keep doing this pausing and editing and all that stuff. Alright, starting the stopwatch again now. Alright, so first thing I want to talk about is stack references. So the benefit here, or the concept behind a stack reference, is that I'm over here with my Pulumi app thing, and I had mentioned this other Pulumi app over here, right? This infra shared, right? So with a stack reference, I can reference that stack. I can reference the outputs and load those. So if I go to this shared one and I go to my program down here, I have 3 output variables, values that are created. So let's say that I want them, and in this scenario, these outputs are the resources, so that way we can load this Azure App Config Store, right, to get that information. So that's the purpose of that. So we'll have some code, and I'll show you that code in a second, but that's the idea, to load those stacks. One of the downsides to this is that now all of a sudden your order matters, right? So if you need to create a new environment, you have to know that, okay, so when I create the QA environment, I have to run that shared one, and then I have to run this other one after it. Or if you like doing a lot of microservices kinds of things, maybe you'll do 7, right? Or maybe you'll consolidate the infrastructure code to its own separate project, and you don't have to worry about that. But that's an architectural decision I will leave to you. The other thing I want to talk about are get functions. Okay, so as an edit note, I'm not going to say it for timing reasons because I've already said that stuff. So let's look at an example of these two things that I've just talked about in our example code. So I'm going to go back to my program, and I'm going to talk about loading from config. So personally, I feel like if I'm referencing another stack and getting the values from it, I think of it as a type of config. So I do that loading in here. So let me go to this custom code. And loading from another stack is very simple. We just need the name of that stack, right? Because the full name is unique within Pulumi. So we create an instance of that. And then we load the individual output values. This method right here is really simple. It's just require output, so I'm making sure the value exists. I probably should actually make this a little bit nicer. I know for a fact that there is a value, but maybe I should do some kind of like this throw new exception or something, right? But I'm gonna leave that alone for now. I think I had to leave it that way. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, so that's the idea. So here we've loaded those values. But then right below that, well, now that I have the value, so I can reference that Azure App Config. Well, why don't I load those, right? So let me load the values from there. So let me get the resource group, that parent resource group. Just make sure it's valid, right? Because if I'm loading it, then I know that the actual resource group is a valid thing. And then, pause this. I'm using the same thing, so let me edit this code. Dot apply name. Okay, and then this output. This is going to be the same. All right. We're going to do this. And you know what? All right. I hope that doesn't change anything. I'm gonna have to rerun Pulumi up right now. So in theory, this will tell me nothing has changed. But that is just to make sure that I didn't break any code stuff right now with these edits. Okay. Hey, cool. 10 unchanged. All right, sure. Let's just say run it. I'm going to move that over here to this other monitor while that runs. Starting the stopwatch now. Okay, so I'm loading this resource group, this Azure resource group, and then I'm using that below, right? So I'm making sure that the thing exists, and then I'm loading things afterwards. So then I load that instance of Azure App Config. This resource later on is going to need the access key to read values from it, because we're just going to use a connection string essentially. So that's what this is loading right here. The access, the keys for the connection string. And so then we're using the loaded resource group and loaded app config, right? Because we got those. And then notice with the get resources, they always use the .invoke method to actually load that information, right? So we're not doing a new resource. So this is getting that read-only resource. All right, any questions on this stuff, what we're talking about? Okay, cool. And so these values, really quickly, just so you know, these values are just passed along. They're in config, and if you care, they are used by the Azure stuff up here. So I believe if we go to the section where we're creating our config, so this is the site config for the Azure function. If I scroll down, the external stacks, the connection string, that thing we were just loading. So that's there. All right. So, pausing this. Looks like we have a typo, so let me just fix that. I am not going to regenerate the presentation right now, just for time. And starting the stopwatch now. All right, the next handful of slides I'm going to talk about, I don't really have some demo code for, but I just want to make sure that you know about them, that they exist. So, Pulumi has the automation API, which took me a second to really understand what that meant. What is the automation API? This is just so you can run Pulumi outside of your console. So normally, we're at our computer and we type Pulumi up or Pulumi destroy, whatever, right? So if you want to do that without having to have a console run that for you, this is what you would use. So the common case right there, as I mentioned, like a CI/CD environment. So something that I do very often is when I create my CI/CD pipelines, I like to use C# in as many places as possible, and so I like to use Cake. So I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Cake, but it's supposed to be, or as they call it, C# make, and the idea is that it just makes writing your CI/CD pipeline a little bit easier, so that you can do it all within C# instead of within YAML. In the end, you actually do have a little bit of YAML. You just have the YAML that calls Cake, and then Cake does, the majority of what you want. But that's where I do certain things like I mentioned earlier with editing my YAML config, where I will put in the value from the GitHub ID number, right, for the build, for the pipeline run. So because I'm running it from this C# code, I then use the automation API to go ahead and run Pulumi from there. That's going to be like step 3 of this whole process. So that's the automation API. I do not have an example here, but it's pretty easy to get started with. Actually, it's really slim in terms of what that API surface is. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is a conceptual thing. This is just a pro-cons list. Should you deploy your app with Pulumi, right? So normally with Pulumi, right, we're thinking about deploying our infrastructure, right? We want to make our storage container buckets. We want to make our DNS entries and firewalls and all that stuff, right? But at the same time, we can deploy our application. So the question is, should we, right? So I've done this before where I've gone back and forth. Right now, I think if you know what you're doing, feeling confident enough, personally, I like to deploy both together. Now, I've seen people say that the downside to that is if something breaks, everything breaks, which is fair, right? It's true. If you're adding new infrastructure, then when you run Pulumi up, you're only going to break the new stuff in that environment. But the downside is if you're deploying them together, the downside is sorry, that was the downside. The upside is it's a little simpler, right? In that it's together. So if you have things separate, then you're gonna have to use something like the automation API to load things, like load those app config values and all of that kind of stuff, and then it's not too bad at that point, but you're just writing more code is really what I'm getting down to. So pros and cons of this, I think personally, if you're greenfield and you want to automate everything you can with Pulumi, it's easier to also deploy the application with it. It's not always possible. It's not always that easy to do. I'm using Azure Functions here, and that's just uploading a file to Azure Blob. So you can totally do that with a bunch of things. But yeah, so it all completely depends. If you're in the container world and you're using Kubernetes or whatever, yeah, you can. I don't actually know how easy or possible it is to have Pulumi deploy the app to that container registry, right? But you can have something deployed to the container registry, and then with Pulumi you set the value of which instance, right, which version of that image to load. So that's that's completely up to you on what you think works better for your application, your maturity level, your organization, that kind of stuff. All right, next concept: automated testing. First of all, anytime you have any kind of logic, you should have some form of automated testing for it. Now, Pulumi does have the ability to mock out certain things that Pulumi does, so that you can actually run unit tests on your code. Personally, I don't feel like that's very useful in the sense that I have always tried to avoid adding custom logic to my Pulumi code. It's just load up the config and create my resources. But if your code does have to have some logic to, if this, and this, then create these extra resources, then yeah, you're probably going to want to test that out. You can, with unit tests are, preferable in that sense. But I argue that automation tests are going to be easier. So automation tests, as far as that goes, is just running Pulumi up, verify, check that certain resources have been created, and then, Pulumi destroy. That's essentially what you're doing with that. So I do not have any code examples for this. I just wanted to bring these up as examples, as something to keep in mind and think about when you're creating your Pulumi applications. All right, let's see. Okay, and pretty much the last big thing, but there's one more slide after this. Pulumi resources. So, a custom resource with Pulumi. So, we look at the Pulumi registry and we see, everything that we can create with Pulumi, all of these other cloud providers and all of that stuff. And what happens if we want to create a wrapper around that stuff? We want to say, okay, well, I want, to be able to create, let's see, as an example, like I want to simplify the standard way that in our organization we create Azure Functions. And I'm going to use that as an example because I keep talking about it. But with an Azure Function, you have a storage account and you have the Azure Function stuff, but you also have the config values and all of these other things. So let's say that you want to simplify that. So then you would create a library and you would create a custom resource. Now the custom resource is just a wrapper because it's really going to create those other 4 resources below it. And so now you're just creating a library that makes it easy, so that way someone who uses it, they pull that into their code. They can say new my Azure Function stuff, and then give it whatever config property values, and then it can go ahead and create everything. So that's a nice way to abstract working with some of these things when you're able to do the abstraction, right? It's a little bit hard to do that abstraction sometimes with these cloud resources because they are very specific to the cloud provider. So just wanted to call that out as an option, as something that can help you save code or standardize some code, right? Make something a template. And then one of the things that I do want to call out is when you're creating any kind of library with Pulumi, you can write your code in one of the supported languages and then go through a process. There's some work to it, but you can then export that library as the library of the other languages. So, for example, if I were to write a new library in C#, I could then take that NuGet package and create separate things like an npm package, and I always forget what they are, the Python ones. I can create the Python ones. Yeah. So definitely something to think about, right? And consider for your organization, because when you it's just one team working on stuff, it's pretty easy to just copy paste a lot of that code. But if you're making a lot of resources, you're going to want to start standardizing on things. All right. And then the last thing that I do want to pull out talking about things is Pulumi AI. So that is AI, artificial intelligence, not AL, my name. So different things. However, when I do read about AI online, I do regularly think things are talking about me, saying Al is going to take over the world, which I won't. Trust me, I'm not competent enough for that. So maybe a small country, when I'm senile, I'll think about it. But no, that's not going to happen. So Pulumi AI, you can use AI to generate a lot of this stuff. So you can go to pulumi.com/AI, and it has a nice little web portal there so you can give some kind of prompt and say, I want a blah blah blah. I want a website, a static website hosted on AWS. And then it'll generate the code for you, and you can tell it which code language to use. So it's handy from a getting started point. I like to go here when I am using some new Pulumi stuff and I'm not sure yet. How does this work with my programming language of choice on my cloud provider that I want to use? And so it's great as a head start, but giving you the warning, it is current generation AI, which means it will tell you things are correct when it's not always correct, right? So there is that fear that it's going to give you something that doesn't compile, or it's going to give you something that is just wrong, right? I asked it a while ago for something to do with DNS stuff, and it ended up using a completely different resource that would have set DNS records, but it's not used for the thing that I was using, right? So just an example of that kind of stuff. So, alrighty. Let's see. And that is the end of this talk. So, again, you can get all of this info, the demo code, and these slides if you scan that QR code, or just go to my website, programmeral.com, and it's going to be the first post that loads right there. The one with the Boston Code Camp wording in the title. So we have some time left. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left. So any questions you have, we can go ahead and go over that now. I also have all of this demo code that I've written. So if anyone wants to go ahead and ask questions about it so that I don't think that it was a waste of my time, feel free to do that too. All right. Stopping that. So I am at 48 minutes, which is actually pretty good, I think. So I'm always in the mindset of, when I create a new talk, oh no, how am I going to talk for a whole hour on this thing? And then I start creating the resources and everything. Oh no, how am I only going to talk for 1 hour on this thing? And so, cool. I'm glad that I'm getting better at this concept. So that 48 minutes, I will get that a little bit better or worse as time goes on. So between now and a week and a half from now, when I actually do give this talk, I'm going to be practicing this a few more times, mostly because this is my newest talk, but I also want to improve that number. I want to get it closer to 50 minutes, especially because there were a couple of times where I trailed off. I had to stop to make changes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. All right. So that's it. That's it for this live stream. Again, if you have any questions, on the process for making a proposal for a conference or any kind of meetup or anything like that, there are tons of resources online. I definitely do not consider myself an expert. Maybe intermediate in that I've just spent enough time and I like have my own way of doing that, but probably still I still consider myself beginner on that. So cool. So again, if you have any questions, this video, you can just send them into the chat. Or I'm still on Twitter. I still, unfortunately, use that one pretty heavily. You can find me at Programmer Al on Twitter. I was not able to get the Programmer Al name for Threads, and I'm still not on Blue Sky. So just go to Twitter or this chat right here. That's the easy one. All right.